So, my conclusion would be something like this: both liberal and conservative political parties and their agendas are working on the same insanity. Michael Knowles rightly identifies the issue, though: idolatry of the self. Of course, that's not a political idea, that's a theological one. What he fails to realize is that both political parties are fruit of this great sin, idolatry. If sin is like a two-sided coin, it doesn't do any good to taunt the tails and herald the heads. The whole coin is damned. And that seems to me to be the problem with politics in the first place. No matter how the coin lands in the flip, the problem cannot be solved.
How is the left responding to the Trump administration's continued popularity? Why? With more political violence.
We got a long one today, so throw on your thinking caps. Yesterday, Michael Knowles was invited to speak at the University of Pittsburgh, and I believe we need to ponder what he said. In this first clip, he basically is providing examples of recent terroristic violence that he believes leftist ideologies has produced. Don't worry though, this video is bipartisan. We're going to look at the pros and cons of what he said, and I think a consistent and timeless principle emerges.
Just last Thursday, 40 leftists attacked campus conservatives during an event that featured Brandon Tatum. Obviously, there were plenty of threats here on us tonight, and for weeks now, we have seen a nationwide campaign of leftists targeting not only conservatives, but anyone who owns an electric car produced by a company that is owned by a guy who sometimes advises President Trump. On March 20th, 3 people were charged with throwing Molotov cocktails at Tesla dealerships and charging stations around the country. In Oregon, a man shot up a Tesla showroom in the town of Salem. He should not be confused with another Oregon man who shot up a different Tesla showroom in a different town. Leftists in Seattle set 4 Cybertrucks on fire in early March before another wacko set a Model S on fire a couple of weeks later. When leftists are not shooting up the electric car dealerships or setting them on fire, they are keying them, denting them, and spray painting them with graffiti, usually in the form of a swastika. There is something kind of funny that the left, more than anyone, other than maybe Kanye West, the left, it's the only group in the country that is presenting swastikas in public life and then claiming to be the anti-fascist party.
So Mr. Knowles is engaging in typical political propaganda. The progressive left lends and leads to anarchy, and the conservative right is busy conserving everything the left is trying to destroy. The majority of this talk is basically him providing example after example of this presupposed political maxim from history up to the present day, and of course his examples here were recent actions. And to a certain degree, I believe that he is spot on. I think it's fair to say that liberal ideologies are the influence for why a person would destroy Teslas, for example. If those people were not actively engaged in the political wars, they would not have enacted the terrorism that they did. However, the question begs for me, is it only liberal and leftist ideologies that leads to these type of tyrannical and irrational behaviors? I'm thinking, for example, of ISIS. ISIS, of course, is a fundamentally zealous and conservative group of Muslims, and they are terrorists. So I'm not sure his presupposition that liberal and leftist ideologies are the only cause of these terroristic actions. Like a true critical thinker, though, Michael Knowles admits that this tendency can be found by conservative thinkers as well.
Political violence is not exclusively a left-wing phenomenon, but it is distinctly a left-wing phenomenon.
However, he argues it's more prevalent and distinct in leftism. But notice his next move. Michael Knowles will not provide ample examples of conservative failure, but jump straight into just war theory. The conservatives are enacting just war, and liberals are propagating unjust war.
Some kinds of political violence are justified. I know that's going to be the headline in the papers when they report about this. Probably Media Matters is sending that clip around already. But it's true. It's true. A just war would be an example of justified political violence. Just, it's right there in the name, so simple. For millennia, all over the world, societies have understood that some kinds of war can be justified. Some are not justified, but some are justified. Many of the best thinkers have reasoned about what makes a war just. Called by a sovereign authority, has a just cause, is fought with the right intentions, seeks good and merely tolerates evil, involves proportionality, and any number of other criteria, you could call that a just war.
The question raised in my mind is this: is it possible for a war to be just? Can a war begin in pure and good intention? Is there any sense in which war is virtuous? I need to study this more, but I think the answer for me, just off the top of my head, is no. Wars might be necessary, but they aren't good. They aren't ultimately just either, because only God is that. But let's continue. Mr. Knowles then provides an example of capital punishment, and I'm not going to show that clip as just war. And then he provides his thoughts on what would be an unjust war. Let's look at that.
Other kinds of political violence are not justified. Terrorism, for instance. It's the targeting of civilians to achieve political ends.
Remember that definition of terrorism.
It's the targeting of civilians to achieve political ends. That is not justified. Vigilante murder, not justified. Even beyond fatal political violence, even vandalism of civilians' private property to advance an ideology, that would not be justified. This is not just my personal opinion or my suspicion. This is the shared view of serious moral thinkers for millennia. If anyone disagrees, if anyone thinks that terrorism is morally justified, I encourage you to come line up and present your case to me in the Q&A. I think our Antifa friends are still shrieking outside, so I don't think they're going to make it for the Q&A, but if some of them do, perhaps they can make an argument. But perhaps not. Actually, more likely they probably won't.
So, unjust war for Michael Knowles is terrorism, vigilante murder, which means something like mafia type groups who murder on their own self appointed terms, as one example, and vandalism. So, his conclusion is basically this: these types of unjust warfare are what the liberals do and the conservatives don't. That's his argument. Let's take up his challenge in the Q&A though. We will watch his whole answer and then think about what he is saying.
The ethical and philosophical argument for why we should pursue an imperialist Christian foreign policy.
Sure. Deus vult, that's 2 words, and you've got the whole answer right there. I'm not sure that I would advocate a fully imperialist Christian foreign policy. One, because there doesn't seem to be much appetite for it. Trump ran as a nationalist to focus more at home. 2, Christendom cracked up at least 5 centuries ago, if not further back, and so it's a little tricky to galvanize a united Christian West to go, slay the Saracens and reclaim the Holy Land or something like that. But I think there is a modest kind of Christian imperialism that we should take seriously. For instance, when in Armenia, the oldest Christian nation in the world, Christian before the Edict of Milan even before the Roman Empire tolerated Christianity, when Christians are under attack by Muslims in Armenia, I think it would behoove us to help them, or at least not to hurt them. When you have Christians being persecuted in the Middle East, as has been the case for many centuries now, but in particular over recent decades, I think it would behoove us to help them. Because we're a Christian nation, and the leftists and the secularists can deny it all they want, but God's on our money, God's in our national anthem, and John Adams says that the principles of the revolution were the principles of Christian morality. So even if there's some disagreement over precisely what Christianity means, Americans knew it when they saw it, at the very least. And if you go back before the founding era, America was obviously founded by zealous Protestant Christians who came here on the Mayflower, which is an excellent cigar company that I encourage people to check out. That, I think, is helpful and necessary. Trump ran as a nationalist, and some of his supporters veer into isolationism. However, Trump's gut, I think, is a little more robust. I think he's a little more inclined toward empire. He wants Greenland. He wants Canada. I think he's serious about acquiring America's evil top hat. He wants to help South Africans who are being persecuted, white South Africans who are being persecuted by the government and by the whole country there. He recognizes that nations have interests. So we can't just look only inside. He recognizes that America is the global hegemon. And so we're going to flex some power. We're not another country like Yemen or Somalia or something. We're the United States of America, so we can't deny that. We can be prudent, though. He doesn't want to get us involved in forever wars for abstract and dubious liberal ideological reasoning that are going to cost us blood, treasure, and achieve very little in terms of America's national interest.
All right, I don't want to belabor this too much any longer because I want to get to Bishop Barron and the principle we need to extract from this. But here are a few moves to what he is saying that I think are important to understand. Firstly, I agree with Mr. Knowles' idea of a modest implementation of Christian virtue and morals into the broader society. I think that would be helpful. I do believe that his vision of what that looks like is slightly skewed. To me, it would look more like a blend of liberal empathy and conservative morality if I have to use those politically charged terms. Secondly, I'm a little bit weary about his view of the breakdown of Christendom during the Reformation 500 years ago. This seems to imply to me that the Holy Spirit is failing in maintaining his church and his impact in the world. I don't think it's theologically honest to make that move and to place political conservative solutions over the top of theological ones, but more on that in a minute. Thirdly, and you might have missed this, when Michael Knowles elaborated on what his modest view of a re Christianization might look like, he thinks in broad global terms. Christians should help Israel and other Christians around the world. In other words, his vision of what makes Christianity compelling and captivating is to reach outside of the walls, to extend our hands outside of America. I wonder how this jives with his conservative policies that he so passionately defends often. Fourthly and lastly, we need to go back to what Mr. Knowles says about terrorism. Remember his definition?
It's the targeting of civilians to achieve political ends.
In light of this definition and what he is saying about Trump's plans for imperialism, I can't help but wonder if this looks more like a terrorist group than a conservative political party. Now, calm down. I'm not saying that this is necessarily the case. I'm saying we need to think critically about this. I find it odd that his entire speech was about liberal woke and wackoism, and when he has to go off the cuff in the Q&A, he starts to actually sound like one himself. He defames Canada, calling it an evil top hat. And he has no problem with the idea that America is superior and doesn't balk at what seems to be Trumpian tyrannicism. And I think that's something that we all need to agree on. If Trump taking over Canada is not terrorism, it is tyrannicism. And when you think about it, tyrannicism is just as insane and illogical to defend as transgenderism. So my conclusion would be something like this. Both liberal and conservative political parties and their agendas are working on the same insanity. Michael Knowles rightly identifies the issue, though, idolatry of the self. Of course, that's not a political idea, that's a theological one. What he fails to realize is that both political parties are fruit of this great sin, idolatry. If sin is like a two-sided coin, it doesn't do any good to taunt the tails and herald the heads. The whole coin is damned. And that seems to me to be the problem with politics in the first place. No matter how the coin lands in the flip, the problem cannot be solved. The only things I've mentioned here that I want to look at further is this idea of just war theory. I mentioned the tension I perceive between justice and war. Of course, just war theory is a Catholic position, and therefore I think I need to study it a little bit more. And so here is Bishop Barron to help me and hopefully help you unpack this idea and this subject. Check this out.
I'm standing in the Annapolis National Cemetery. It's a military cemetery. It's about a stone's throw from the Naval Academy, where I spoke last night. And some people wonder whenever a minister of the gospel, a priest, a bishop speaks at a military academy to military people, is there a contradiction between the commitment to be a soldier and the gospel? And of course, I see where the tension comes from. The Sermon on the Mount, the love of enemies is central. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who maltreat you. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn and give them the other. Resist not evil, Jesus says. So there is, of course, coming up out of the Sermon on the Mount, a great tradition of nonviolence within Christianity. In point of fact, in the early centuries, A lot of Christians felt, no, they couldn't serve in the armed forces. They had to walk the peaceful way of Jesus. Well, I've spoken many times before about the extraordinary power of the path of nonviolence. And when you see it practiced by someone like Martin Luther King, who knew those texts very well, it can be, in certain circumstances, a very effective way, lovingly to engage the wickedness of another. I've compared it sometimes to Aikido, the martial art where you use the momentum of your opponent against him. So I believe very much in the power of nonviolence, both as a witness, but also as an effective tool in opposing violence. But let me add this now. When you get to the 4th century and a figure like St. Augustine of Hippo, the Christian church is realizing that, granted all of that and not gainsaying any of it, we live in such a finite, conflictual world, sinful world, a fallen world, that sometimes the only way to oppose great wickedness is to use violence or use force. Now, begin not at the grand national level, but at the very personal level to see the point. You're the father of a family. Someone has invaded your home. They're threatening your wife and children. Well, I mean, what do? You're unlikely to stage a nonviolent social protest. I mean, at that point, you're going to use force to defend the lives of the innocent. So extrapolate from that. That's what Augustine does. Extrapolate from that experience now to the national level. If a nation is being aggressed in such a way that innocent life is being threatened, sometimes in this fallen, finite, conflictual, sinful world, you have to use requisite force to protect the innocent. And it's from that instinct that the so-called just war theory emerges. Augustine being one of the great exponents of it, St. Thomas Aquinas adding to it, and then throughout the Catholic tradition, people have added nuance to it. And I want to make the point that the just war theory, far from a warmongering exercise, far from, justifying all war, is in fact setting very severe limits to war. You might say always haunting the just war theory is Jesus' great call to the love of enemies and so on. So what are some of these criteria that the Catholic tradition has invoked to justify war in certain circumstances? Well, here's the first one. A just war must be declared by a competent authority. That's to say, some government agency or individual who speaks for the totality of the people. So a just war is not one that's prompted by some particular group or some family working out a problem. It's declared by some agency that speaks for the whole people. Here's a second criterion. There must be a just cause. Now, in recent years, the church has really restricted this. The only finally just cause is when innocent life is being aggressively threatened. So when a country is being attacked or invaded, it may, as it were, put its arms up in self-defense. So there must be a competent authority declaring the war, a just cause. A third consideration, there's got to be a proportion between the goal to be attained and the terrible destructiveness of the war. And so if you're convinced that, no, that the price is just too high here, yes, we're trying to defend the innocent, but in the process we're going to cause far much more mayhem, well then we're not dealing with a just war. A couple other criteria that I think are interesting. One is the reasonable hope of success. So entering into a just war, you have to have some sense that, yes, we're likely to be successful in this enterprise. If it's a hopeless undertaking, well then it's not really a justified war. A final criterion is what we call the right intention of the belligerents or of the warriors. So even if the war is justified, but you're going into it with the wrong attitude, you're fighting for another reason. I just don't like those Germans or Japanese or Russians. Well, that's not a legitimate ground. Now here's the thing. For the war to be justified, all of these criteria have to obtain simultaneously. All of them have to be the case. Now, I hope you can see from that far from, encouraging war. These are setting very strict limits on war. Moreover, what I've just described are called the jus ad bellum requirements. That means, justice on the way to war. So what would justify going to war? There are two more criteria called the jus in bello criteria. That means what's justified in the actual fighting of the war. And here we have two very interesting ones, namely proportionality. So again, there's some proportion between the goal to be obtained and the destructiveness of the means being used. And the second criterion is discrimination, that we can discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. So there's not a wanton destruction of the lives of innocents, because that would defeat the whole purpose. I'm trying to protect the lives of the innocent. So, for example, let's say, and I think most would agree with this, that World War II met the criteria for the jus ad bellum. That we'd say, yeah, World War II was a justified war. Nevertheless, when it comes to the actual fighting World War II, there are certain elements I think now we'd have to say were not justified. Think of those terrible fire bombings of Dresden and Frankfurt and Tokyo, not to mention the atomic bombs, which in my judgment and that of I think most others, would violate both proportionality and discrimination. Again, we're setting severe limits to war, always keeping in mind the great command to love. Now, keep that in mind. To love means to will the good of the other. What's the motivating justification for war? It's the protection of the innocent. That's an act of love. See, don't set love and warfare necessarily as opposed to each other. To love is to will the good of the other. The father defending his family is loving his family, right? And so soldiers defending their country in a just war are engaging in an act of love. Now, as you see behind me, the graves of all these soldiers, can we, with great admiration, remark the virtue in these people? And I'd say, yeah. Think of the great cardinal virtues, justice being one of them. Yeah, people that went to war convinced that they were fighting in a just war, trying to set something right. They were following the virtue of justice. Think of the virtue of prudence. That's kind of canny moral know-how. Sure, they exhibited that. The virtue of temperance. That means the self-control required in order to get the job done morally. I think of the kids I met yesterday at the Naval Academy going through all their different forms of training, and they're being, compelled to discipline their own passions and desires, to discipline their own bodies. Well, that's a virtue of temperance required for the achievement of justice. And then, of course, probably most obviously, courage, the great virtue. It's hard to imagine any sailor or soldier not exhibiting courage. So we think of the paradigmatic soldier fighting in a just war, someone who exhibits these great virtues and someone whom we admire, and who is finally ordered to and by love. And that's why, even as we honor the great tradition of nonviolence, as we should, we can also honor those who are willing to fight in a just war. Let me make just one more observation. My mentor, Cardinal George, said this years ago, and it's always stayed in my mind. Like me, Cardinal George admired people like Dorothy Day, who was a pacifist. Think of Stanley Hauerwas, a theologian I admire very much, who's a strict pacifist. Cardinal George said, I'm glad there are some pacifists in the church, the same way I'm glad there are some celibates in the church. Now, what did he mean? Well, both celibates, those who don't marry, and pacifists, those who will not fight, are living even now as we will all live in the kingdom of God. Remember, Jesus says, well, in the kingdom of God, no one is married or given in marriage, because we're living at a higher pitch of intensity. So celibates here below, like pacifists here below, are witnessing to that place of utter love and utter peace that we aspire to. But mind you, Cardinal George said, I don't want everyone to be a celibate here below, nor do I want everyone to be a pacifist. And I think that's a very good way to honor all the various values involved. So as I finished my talk last night at the Naval Academy, I'm in this magnificent chapel, and the windows are filled with these inspiring scenes. And one of them is two stained glass windows that kind of speak to each other. One is Michael, the warrior angel, but on the other side is an angel holding the dove of peace. And the point is that all just war finally serves the purposes of peace. And I would say finally serves the purpose of love, the defense of the innocent.
The principle I was thinking about most while interacting with Michael Knowles and Bishop Barron is the importance of ordering our identity correctly. If we are political first and Christian second, I think we can draw some errant conclusions and be impassionately inflamed towards positions that I don't think we necessarily need to. These are difficult issues, and I think we have to be a Christian first and politically charged second, because I think that creates an order that is necessary to make the necessary distinctions on these difficult issues. Hopefully, I got that out. Again, I like both Knowles and Barron, so I don't want you to think that I'm bashing Knowles to elevate Barron or I'm using Barron to promote and propagate my specific positions. I really am trying to think critically about these things. So, this is what I think we all have to take away, because we can't just look out into the broader world or just look at what these two people are saying. We have to make it reflect back on us and how we are to think about our own experience, our own identities. So, what identity is ordering you? What identity is ordering me? Am I a Christian first and politically charged second, or vice versa? I think that it is necessary to reflect on this and to be thinking about how each one of us can begin to let the Christian doctrine and Christian theology influence everything else in our worldview. And if we don't do that, I think it looks like belittling others, defaming others, and not seeing the necessary distinctions in things that we need to see. Yeah, I think I'm going to leave it at that. I hope that makes sense. I hope that was clear. And I hope we can really begin to see that politics can't save us, only Jesus can. The church is triumphant, it will win, it will win in the end. And if we're trying to provide politically charged answers to problems that only have theological solutions, I think we create a bigger problem. And I don't think that we actually proclaim and spread the gospel and Christianity and its Christ better. I think he is lost in the cause, not the cause we are promoting. All right, that's all I have for this video. Please be sure to like and subscribe. Remember that Christianity is Christ, and without him, there is no Christianity. And I'll see you in the next one. Peace.